Hey guys, BrandonioProductions here, and welcome to my third tutorial in the How to Use Dictionaries in Visual Basic .NET tutorial series. Now, in the past two tutorials, I went over the basics of how to use a dictionary, and then in the next tutorial, I went over applications of using a dictionary, and in that tutorial, I actually went over how to create a swear filter using a rich text box and dictionaries. Now, in this third and final tutorial in the dictionary series, I will actually explain how you can use dictionaries to represent custom objects within an application. So, of course, in order to actually make an application that uses custom objects in a dictionary, the first thing we need is a custom objects. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click on my project over here, press Add, and then press New Item. Now I'm actually going to add a new class to my project, and I'm going to name this class Student. So what we're going to be doing is in our application itself, we are going to create a dictionary which holds a list of students. Now each student will actually have a key of an ID number. So dictionaries are definitely one easy way to manage information that can be retrieved with an ID number or a certain key of some value. So now that I have my public class student here, I'm just going to fill in the details. So I'm going to create three private variables. Well, let's start with private first name as string, private last name as string, and what else does a student have? Okay, private average grade letter as string. So now I'm just going to go ahead and make the constructor here. So first thing we have is the default constructor, which basically fills everything in with blanks. So first name is nothing, last name is nothing, average grade letter is nothing, and then we've also got, of course, the regular constructor, which expresses everything that we need to actually insert into the parameters. So what we've got here is we've got a basic class that stores information about students. Now, these students can actually, well, all students have a first name, a last name, and then an average grade letter. So that would be A, B, C, D, or F. And then we've got a constructor here. So when you actually create a new student, they automatically have a first name and a last name and an average grade letter, all of nothing. And however, when you create a new student, you can also specify the values of what their first name, last name, and average grade letter are going to be. Now, as in good style, I am going to make a new region, and this region is going to be called Properties. And inside of this, I'm just going to list out all the public properties. So public property, first name as string. So when I get this public property, I'm going to want to return first name, the private variable. And when I set, I'm going to want to set the private variable first name equal to the value that the user submits. I'm also going to make a public property last name as string, and then when I get this, I'm going to return the private last name, and when I set it, I'm going to set the private last name to a value, and then finally I'm going to do the same thing with the average grade letter, so grade letter as string, and then I'm going to get, and I'm going to return the average grade letter private variable, and then when I set, I'm going to set the average grade letter private variable to the value that the user specifies. So these properties are just going to keep track of the three private variables that we created and allow other classes and objects to access them. So I'm just going to go ahead and minimize that region, and I'm also going to create a new region called constructors, constructors, and I'm just going to go ahead and take our constructor code, plop it in there, minimize both of them, and then minimize the region. So now, as you can see, we've got a very nice organized class here. So there are actually going to be a few methods with the student Well, actually, no. I'm not even going to make any methods with this student. So we've got the information that we need, and we've got a main information outline for the student. There's nothing else we're really going to need for this sample application, so we're just going to jump back into our form. So in our form, currently we have nothing. However, we want our application to actually be able to manage students. And each student is going to have, of course, an ID number. So the way we're going to have this set up is we're going to actually create a, where is it? Wow. Sorry, I was under pressure right there. We're actually going to create a little list box here, and the list box is going to house actually, no, that's not what we're going to do. I actually didn't think about how to make this program beforehand, so what I'm actually going to do is we're actually going to have the program enter some student information. So this is actually going to be a fairly well-designed program. So in order to do this, we're going to create a group box, and the group box here, the title of the group box is going to be called Student Information. And inside of the group box, we actually can have a label here, another label here, and two text boxes. Sorry for being so slow about adding these components. So the label is, we're going to name our label 1 LBL underscore student name. So we declare that it's a label, and then we just declare the label's description, and then the text is going to be student name, and then a colon here. And then we're going to move the text box over to reflect the actual label itself, and we're going to rename the text box to txt underscore student name. So what we're doing is we're providing the user a basic area where they can insert new information about the student and add them to the dictionary. So I'm creating a new label with the name of LBL underscore student ID, and then the text for that label is going to be student ID, and then a colon. And I'm just going to go ahead and drag this text box right over, make it align with the other one, and rename it to txt underscore student ID. And then I'm just going to go ahead and minimize or make this group box a little smaller and add in a button. This button is going to be called btn underscore add, and then the button text is going to be add student. So as you can see, we have a relatively well-designed program here. And then inside of our actual program, we're actually going to go ahead and insert a list box just as we described. And this list box is going to go ahead and reflect the entirety of the database itself, or the dictionary itself. And then I'm just going to go ahead and add two buttons here. One button is going to be to edit the selected student, so we're going to name button 2 btn underscore edit, and then this text is going to say edit student. And then we're going to rename the other button to btn underscore delete, and this button will just delete the student, so delete student. And finally, I'm just going to rename this list box to lst underscore students. So now we've got our components and our basic program layout. Now all we need to do is create the functionality. So let's go ahead and dive right into the code. So I'm just going to go ahead and double click the form here. Now the first thing we want to do in creating our student manager here is we want to actually create a dictionary that holds the student's ID number and then the student itself. So I'm going to say private student database, whichever one you want to say, as dictionary, and it's going to be, the key is going to be of integer, and the value is going to be of a student. So this is essentially using our custom created student object in order to keep track of the students. So we've got, instead of actually creating a dictionary which houses a string, and then in that string is the student's name, the student's first name, the student's last name, and then the student's grade, all delineated by a colon or a semicolon or something, we can instead simply create a student object which houses all this information, so there's no confusion. And then when the form is actually loaded, I'm just going to say student database equals a new dictionary of integer student, and this just allows us to actually insert information into the database. So let's go ahead and jump right into the form here. So we're going to double click into the Add Student button here. So the Add Student button will be pressed when the user types in a student name and a student ID, and then they want to actually add the student onto the database. So what we're going to actually do is, first thing is we're going to check to make sure that the user has actually entered an ID or a student name. So we're going to say if txt underscore student ID is nothing, then we're going to display a message box that says, or txt underscore student ID dot text is nothing, or better yet, we can do dot equals and then empty quotation marks for an empty string, because if the user does not actually enter anything, then it will be submitted as an empty string. So then we'll display a message box to the user. A student ID needs to be entered. However, if that is not the case, then we are going to check to see if the student name was actually entered. So if the text equals nothing, then we're going to say message box, a student name needs to be entered. And after we display each message box, we're actually going to exit out of the sub with a return statement, so the sub cannot actually continue any further. So now we actually need to do all of the logic that actually needs to be applied when a student is added. So we just checked to make sure the user actually has entered a student ID and a student name. Now the next thing we actually need to determine is if the user is actually editing something, or if they're actually adding the student. So what we're actually going to be doing, or what we're actually going to do, is since the user can press edit student at any time, and then the student will actually pop back into the add student panel, and when that happens, we're actually going to change the text of the button to say edit student. So currently the text of the button says add student. However, when the person actually presses edit student, the text of the button will change to edit student. So we're going to say if txt or btn underscore add dot text equals add student. So we need to make sure that we get the capitalization correct. Student is also capitalized. So add student. Then, so if the text equals add student, then we want to add a student to the dictionary. So now, since we're adding a student to the dictionary, we can actually provide a whole nother method to actually add a student. So we're going to say public sub add student, and we're going to take in an ID number as integer and a student as student. Okay. Now, one of the things that we actually missed in designing our application is, if we jump back to our form here, we see we have the student name and the student ID number. However, we didn't actually specify the other fields within our student class here. We didn't actually specify a first name, a last name, and an average grade letter. So this is just a simple mistake that we can go ahead and revise. So I'm just going to move this button down and resize this group box a little bit. Drag student ID up to the top. And I'm doing this just by highlighting multiple objects and dragging them as a whole. And then we can actually go ahead and add another label for the student's last name, and then another label for the student's average grade letter. So, and then we're going to add the corresponding text boxes as well. So now that we've got these corresponding labels and text boxes, we can go ahead and rename them. So we've already got student name. However, we're going to change that to LBL student first name. And we're just going to first name, change the text to reflect that. And then we're going to change the name of the text box to txt underscore student first name. Now we're going to do the same thing with these other labels. So we are going to add a new label, and it's going to be LBL underscore student last name. And then the text is going to be last name. And then we just add in this text box here. And we're going to change the name of the text box, of course, to txt underscore student last name. And then finally, we've got the last piece of information here that we can enter, and that would be the just trying to get everything aligned here. And this would actually be the average grade letter. So LBL grade letter. And then we just change the text here to average grade letter. And then after that, we can just change. Now this text box is going to be small because they're just going to be inserting a grade letter here. So we're going to change the text to, or the text box name to txt underscore average grade letter. And we're not going to alter the text value of that at all. So now if the user clicks Add Student, we actually want to make sure that all of the fields are actually filled in. So in order to do this, instead of actually individually checking all the fields, we're just going to scroll through all the fields at once in a for statement. So we're going to say dim C as control, and then we're going to say for each C. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually use a for statement to scroll through every text box inside of the student group box. So we're going to say for each C as control because we're going to want to scroll through all of the controls in the group box in group box 1 dot controls. Now what we need to do is we need to actually, because right now we're scrolling through all of the things that we've actually inserted inside of the group box. So now we need to see if the control that we've actually scrolled through is a text box. So if type of C is text box, then so if the type of the control that we've just reached is a text box, then we need to actually save the text box so we can access its properties. So dim C text as text box equal to, and then we need to convert C to a text box. So we can do this with C type. And then we're going to convert the object C to text box, and then we're going to say if C.text or ctext.text rather dot equals nothing, then we are actually going to display a message to the user: all fields must be filled. And then we're going to simply exit out of the sub. So with this little block of code here, all we're doing is scrolling through each control inside of the group box controls. So to see what that looks like, we're going to be scrolling through each one of these highlighted each one of these highlighted objects. And then after we do that, we are simply checking to see if the object is a text box. And if it's not, then we're just going to go on to the next object. If it is a text box, however, we are getting the text box itself by converting C into a text box. We're checking its text value. If it's nothing, then we're alerting the user that all fields must be filled. So the next thing we're doing is we're actually adding the student into the dictionary. So we can go ahead and continue with our AdStudent method here. So in the AdStudent method, the user is going to send in an ID number and a student as student. As the type student that we just created. So this piece of code is actually going to be relatively easy. So the first thing we need to do is check to make sure this ID number does not exist. So we're going to say if student database dot keys dot contains let me see here. So we do want to check if the key contains the ID number. However, it seems as though it's not going to let us do that. Oh wait. there's my bad. There's actually a if student database dot contains key function here, so we can actually check to see if the key is contained. So now we send in the ID number that the user actually submitted. So if the student database actually contains the key, then we want to alert the user that it contains the key and ask if they would like to replace it with a new student. So we are now going to dim a MSG message box result as a dialog result here. And then we're going to make this message box result equal to the new message box that we are going to display to the user. So we're going to say that ID number already exists. It belongs to, and then we are going to output the student's first name and the student's last name. So the next step in our process is to actually create a student variable called student2check, and it's going to be a student, and we're going to set it equal to the student that is saved in the student database with the according ID number. So we're going to say student database.item and then send in the ID number that the user specified. So now we can pull in an ampersand here and just say student2check dot first name, and then I'm going to insert a space and then another ampersand and then an underscore to continue my code on the next line to keep everything nice and good for this video. And then I'm going to continue with student2check student to, why is it not letting me access student2check here? That is odd. Well, that was interesting. So maybe I was spelling student wrong. So student2check dot last name, and then we are going to ask the user, would you like to replace this student? So then we are actually going to give the user options or a caption, the message box a caption of, oh no. Actually, no, we're making this professional. We want to give the caption replace question mark, and then we want to give the user options of yes and no, and that's really all we want to display to the user. So the user is actually going to click yes or no on the message box, and we're going to use that to see if we want to actually replace the student or not. So if dialog, or rather message box result equals yes, which is selected from IntelliSense's menu right there, then we are going to want to replace the student. So we are now going to say student database dot remove, and we're going to remove the key that matches the ID number, and then we're going to say student database dot add, and we're going to add in the ID number that the user specified, and then the student that the user actually sent in. However, well, actually, yes. However, if the user or if the database does not contain the ID number, then we straight up just want to add the student to the database. So student database dot add ID number and then student. So this code should work for adding a student into the database. So if they already exist within the database, we ask the user if they want to replace it. If they do, then we simply replace the student, and if the student ID does not exist, we simply add it to the database. Now all of this is going to want to be corresponded with the list box, so we're actually going to make, just as in the first dictionary tutorial, a method that actually refreshes the list box. So I'm going to say public sub refresh list box. And then in this actual sub itself, I'm going to first clear the list box of all its items, and then add all of the students within the list box. So I'm going to say lst underscore students.items.clear, which clears the list box of all its items, and I'm going to proceed to add the students into the list box. So the students are going to be displayed as such. There's going to be an ID number. I'm just going to say 111000000, and then there's going to be a colon, and then the student's first name, student's last name, and then parentheses and their average grade letter. So it's going to be arranged just like that. So we can go ahead and do that right here. So all we have to do is say lst students, or rather, we're first going to want to scroll through all the students to get them and then add them individually to the list box. So we're going to say for each student, or rather s as student, in student database dot values, which is the list of all of the students within the database. No. 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 The first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to get the ID as integer in student database dot keys, and then from that ID we can actually get the values of the student itself. So we now want to say dim student as student equal to student database dot item, and then we're going to send in the ID that we're actually scrolling through. And now we can go ahead and add this item to the list box. So we want to say lst underscore students dot items dot add, and first thing we need to do is insert the ID, and then of course a colon. So since we're appending strings here, we're going to use the ampersand. Otherwise, if we use the plus sign, it's going to try to do math on this, which you can't do math with strings, of course. Then we're going to add a space after the colon to keep things a little organized. And then we're going to say add in the student's first name, then add in a space, and add in the student's last name. And we're going to add in a underscore to keep everything in one little column here. And then we're going to add parentheses, open parentheses, add in the student's average grade letter, so and student dot, there it goes again. Apparently it just doesn't like accessing items when they're on the second line. So student dot grade letter, and we're going to close off these parentheses and then close off the items dot add statement. And there we go. So now we have a method that actually refreshes the list box. So after the add student method is actually completed, we're just going to want to refresh the list box. So now we have a program that effectively adds students to the database, or to the actual program itself. Now this video is actually getting a little long, so I'm actually going to go ahead and split it into two parts. So before I end this part, I'm just going to debug this application so we can see how it looks here. So we're just going to enter a student ID of 100000000, give it a first name of Bob, a last name of Dylan, and a average grade letter of B, just like in the comment example that we pulled. And then if we press add student here, nothing seems to happen, which of course is never good. So the first thing we actually want to test is to make sure that everything is being checked to make sure it's correct. Oh yeah, that's right. So if we press add student here, we do notice that our for statement does work, and it says all fields must be filled. So I just noticed what was wrong. In our button add click method, we actually have if button text equals add student, then we actually want to create a student. So we want to dim student to add as new student and send in the proper information. So the first name of the student is txt underscore student first name. The last name is txt underscore student last name. And the average grade letter is txt underscore student average grade letter, or average grade letter. And then all we're going, oops, I forgot to say dot text on all of these. Okay, so now we can actually go ahead and say add student, call our own add student method, insert the ID number, which is txt, well actually we're going to want to convert it to an integer, so cint to cast to an integer, and then txt underscore student ID dot text. And then as the student to add, we're just going to want to send in our student to add variable. And now we can go ahead and test out the application itself. So we're going to insert a student ID of 1 million or so. First name is going to be Bob, last name is going to be Dylan, average grade letter is going to be B, and we add the student, bam. Now everything displays correctly. So we've got the ID number, a colon, the name, and the last name. So if we alter this ID number and actually insert a different name, so Bobby Dillany, and he has an average grade letter of F, we can add this student, and as you can see, it adds another entry into the database. However, if we try to replace our last Bob Dylan with, let's just say, Ryan Cahoney, spelled weird, who's an A student, and we press Add Student, it says that the ID number already exists and it belongs to Bob Dylan, which indeed it does. If we say to replace this student, we can press Yes, and as you can see, Bob Dylan disappears from our dictionary and it is replaced with Ryan Cahoney or Ryan Cajon. And he has an average grade letter of A. So far, our functionality in our program is actually working quite well. So stay tuned for part 2, in which we will actually complete the functionality by adding in the Edit button and the Delete button. Thanks for watching. Please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe to this video, and I'll talk to you guys later. Peace.